It is one thing for those on the left to hyperventilate over every action that the new U.S. president undertakes. It is something else when longtime conservative thinkers worry about the potential for a slide into authoritarianism. David Frum is a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, now senior editor of The Atlantic, and of course originally hails from these parts. And he joins us now from Washington, D.C. David, delighted to have you back on the program. How's things?
Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality.
Not at all. I must say I can't recall the last time that a magazine article got as much buzz as the one that you have just done. And for those who may not yet have read it, let's read an excerpt here to get us off to the races. Donald Trump, you write, represents something much more radical. A president who plausibly owes his office, at least in part, to a clandestine intervention by a hostile foreign intelligence service, who uses the bully pulpit to target individual critics, who creates blind trusts that are not blind, invites his children to commingle private and public business, and somehow gets the unhappy members of his own political party either to endorse his choices or shrug them off. If this were happening in Honduras, we'd know what to call it. It's happening here instead, and so we are baffled. David, some people are observing that not even a month into Trump's presidency, you are already suggesting that America is turning into a banana republic, and they wonder whether or not you're a little quick off the trigger to come to this conclusion. What say you?
Well, the important things that we need to know about Donald Trump are not things that might happen in the future. They're things that have already happened in the past, things both at home and abroad. I'll admit the single thing that alarms me most is that Donald Trump has opened a question whether, he said this during the campaign, whether he might or might not honor the NATO treaty and protect the NATO allies covered by Article 5, the one that commits the United States and Canada to, and all the other NATO members, each to the protection of the other. We already know that there will not be financial disclosure of any kind, that the tax returns, which every president, beginning with Jimmy Carter, has voluntarily disclosed. Gerald Ford disclosed a large part of his returns. Carter disclosed all of them, every president since. That's not going to happen. The legally required White House disclosure forms, I filled them out, are not very informative. And of course, the Trump Organization is not a public company. We don't know what's going on. But the Trump family itself has told us that they are hugely dependent on influxes of money from Russian investors. The relationship between Trump and the Russians is extremely disturbing. And we all saw that footage of Donald Trump at his June press conference, his last press conference before the election, inviting Russia to hack Hillary Clinton's emails and publish them for the world.
Let's talk about the media. He has already declared, and so has his spokesperson, that the media are, in essence, the official opposition in Washington now, and they intend to be treated that way. How do you believe that Donald Trump can harm the media?
Well, one of the things we need to understand that the media no longer means Reuters, the New York Times, the Financial Times, those familiar brands. The most important media company in America is Facebook. That's where people get their information from. Twitter is one of the top 5. And these new companies, which often lack a sense of themselves as media organizations, are tremendously susceptible to pressure. Let me just give you one example from Twitter, the president's favorite medium. Shortly before the election, about a week before, Twitter canceled a number of accounts belonging to one or another white supremacist. By the way, I don't know that this was a wise thing to do, and I wrote a column at the time criticizing it, but Twitter did it, and it was clearly Twitter's right to do it. It's a private platform. There's no First Amendment claim against Twitter. I spoke to somebody who was very intimately involved with the Trump Organization at the time, and they were outraged. And they talked very menacingly about bringing antitrust actions to bear against Twitter should they win the election. After Donald Trump won, he convened a meeting of tech executives. Twitter was pointedly excluded from the meeting, although it was the president's favorite platform. And around that same time, Twitter reinstated all of those accounts, not only reinstated them, but verified them. Now, if President Trump were to say to the Washington Post, hey, you have a pro-me columnist, you just fired him, I demand you reinstate him on penalty of punishment, we would see what that was. But Twitter is a publisher just as much as the Washington Post is. And everyone who has an account there is a columnist, and Twitter has the right to close our accounts. The president pressured them, apparently, into reopening them. there are other, so when you think about the kinds of pressures that are brought to bear against the media, you have to think about this in 21st century way. And I know this is too long an answer, but let me say one more thing about this. One of the things that the risk really of getting wrong in understanding the Trump presidency is we look back to the 1930s and 40s for examples of what authoritarianism will look like. But we live in a different world. It's not going to look like that. It's not going to function like that. And you have to be alert to the signs of how it would function in the 21st century, not in the middle of the last century.
And your article does that in The Atlantic, and therefore let's play it forward. If the scenario you described today is merely the thin edge of the wedge and it gets worse for media in the United States and beyond, what does that look like?
Well, what it doesn't look like a police state. I don't think it will ever be true that Donald Trump will be able to say to the FBI, go arrest that person because I don't like them. The FBI won't do it. And if the FBI, in some extraordinarily difficult to imagine situation, did it, that person would get before a court, and the courts would let the person go, and the court order would be obeyed. There isn't enough time in a presidency to change the courts to that degree. But what Donald Trump can do, and what he has done, and what his wife has also done, is they can, on their Twitter accounts, point to somebody whom they don't like by name and flood that person's life with death threats. Now, it's not the police, it's not the state. The person still has to leave their home, though. That happened to the head of the Carrier Union local in Indiana. It's happened to journalists who have covered Donald Trump. Some of them have given up journalism altogether because of the flow of death threats. This has happened enough times that if Donald Trump was surprised the first time, he has no excuse for being surprised the second. When Julia Ioffe, now a colleague of mine at The Atlantic, then a contributor to GQ, wrote a profile of Melania Trump that Melania Trump didn't like. It exposed some things about her life, not that they were so shocking, but that Melania Trump had wanted to keep quiet. Again, the Trump family, through their Twitter feeds, conjured up death threats against Julia, violent, misogynistic, and anti-Semitic images that, again, forced her out of her house because people actually crossed the line between digital and real. People actually do, if you get enough of these threats, people do begin to show up outside your door. They begin to show up at your house. They begin to show up sometimes at your parents' house.
Let's talk about one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Steve Bannon. You know him, yes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've met him once. I have a cameo in one of his films, and I was rather unnerved to discover the other day. Somebody reported that in a film treatment he had written for a movie that was never made, he had listed me as one of his intellectual influences, which is kind of an uncomfortable situation to be in, I have to say.
Well, having said that, what do you think of him?
I think we are hugely overestimating his role. The old saying, if only the Tsar knew, when the Cossacks smash up the house. But the Cossacks work for the Tsar. I think Bannon brings an extra edge of both. He's got a strong personal ideology, much more strong than Donald Trump's. And he also has never worked in any large organization before, certainly not government. So there's that much more chaos because of him. And I think he's one of the reasons that this executive order on immigration was such a chaos. But the impetus here does come from President Trump. And so long as Donald Trump is there, I don't doubt that Steve Bannon will be gone in fairly short order. He's attracting too much publicity and too much strong feeling one way or another. That's a dangerous place to be if you're in a White House aide. But I don't think very much will change after he goes, because the problem here is the Tsar, not the Cossack.
He has been overheard apparently saying that Donald Trump is a blunt instrument for advancing his own beliefs. Do you think Bannon is bragging when he says that, or is there something to it?
I hadn't heard that particular quote. That's a very dangerous thing for any staffer to say about any president, and it's never true. You can try, but the beliefs that these things are effective is they are Donald Trump's own beliefs. The infatuation with Russia is Donald Trump's. The connection to Putin, whatever exactly it is Donald Trump's. The undifferentiated approach to Islamic terrorism is Donald Trump. We've gone from 8 years of Barack Obama saying nothing at all Islamic about the Islamic State, and that was ridiculous, to Donald Trump now saying every Muslim in the world is potentially guilty of terrorism, and that's even worse than ridiculous. And the whole thing then carried off with this kind of crazy, even on its own terms, weird stupidity of, if the largest country covered by the president's executive order, the most populous country, is Iran. Well, there's not been a single instance of terrorism inside the United States by an immigrant from Iran or children of the Iranian-American diaspora. Not one, not since 1993 anyway. Meanwhile, the largest collection of American-located terrorists are people from Pakistan and their children, people from the Palestinian territories and their children, people from Egypt and their children, and none of them are covered by the order at all. So if you're going to do these kinds of mass guilt by associations, you're not even picking the right association.
But you're convinced that's Trump and not Bannon? Because that, I must tell you, that is a
I
view
think
that...
the extra incompetence of it is probably Bannon. But look, presidents are responsible for building staffs that work. The Trump White House is a chaos. And one of the things, I think most people in Canada do understand the difference in the cabinet, which is confirmed by the Senate. And that's relatively normal, especially in the security branches. The Secretary of Defense is highly esteemed. Secretary of State looks very competent. CIA director, good reviews for him, and other such people. Versus the White House, which is not Senate confirmed. And that is a chamber of horrors. That's just full of people who shouldn't be there, including the National Security Advisor to the United States, which is one of the most important roles, if not the very most important role in national security. And that's a person who was fired as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency under President Obama, and who's become, as ineffective as he was under Obama, he's become radicalized and is now, again, also very close to the Russians and took their money, in fact.
You're talking Michael Flynn. Let's do one more question on Bannon before we move on, and that is, it's been reported that Bannon's working-class dad lost his retirement savings in the 2008 recession, and bankers, of course, got billions in bailouts during that same period of time, and that this apparently really got under Bannon's skin. And if that's true, does that suggest that he actually, Bannon, has more in common with those on Main Street who feel very disaffected and less in common with the Goldman Sachs Hollywood producer types that he's also hung out with in the past?
Well, a little more than hung out with him. He is himself a former Goldman Sachs banker. He has a tidy little fortune of his own, which he got from Hollywood. Because at one point in his career, he was financing movies. The people he was financing weren't able to pay their bills, and so instead they handed over their share of the residuals from a comedy to be produced that was ultimately known as Seinfeld, and that's how he earns his income. Look, this is the most phony baloney administration ever. The basic operating theory of this administration is you can be an investment banker, you can go to be involved with Goldman Sachs, you can have your suits custom made on Fifth Avenue, but so long as you're rude to people, that makes you a working class hero.
David, how are you not worried about being so blunt about these guys?
Did I say I wasn't worried?
So you are worried.
Of course I'm worried.
What are you worried about?
Well, that gets a little unspecific. I don't know. I have a pretty pessimistic outlook on life, and one of the things I did in this article was I actually thought like a criminal. I tried to think if I had the assignment of make the president improperly rich without being too much at risk at prison, shut down his critics in ways that won't generate alarms within the American constitutional system, how would you do it? So I tried, it's like a caper movie, like Barney in the old Mission Impossible, how would you do it in a way that was practical? And I can imagine I'm not going to now offer them on the air of things they could do to strike at me. There are things they could do to strike at me, and I do, of course I worry about that. You'd be a fool not to. But if you let those worries restrain you from doing what you think you are, what is right, you're something a little worse than a fool, aren't you?
Okay. Let's go on to something that Michael Gerson wrote in the Washington Post recently about the Grand Old Party that you have obviously spent a good chunk of your life caring about, worrying about, and no doubt wondering today what its status is. The quote is, "Perceptive leaders can see their party eventually physically reduced and morally diminished to a fanatical ethno-nationalist core." The Republican Party that you know, is it over?
Well, it's like the parrot in the Monty Python sketch. It's not looking so healthy, but no, I don't think it's quite over. Here, let me put in concrete terms what Republicans face. So one of the most outspoken of the internal opponents of Donald Trump was John Kasich, governor of Ohio. That's the same state that Senator Rob Portman comes from, and Rob Portman outran Trump in Ohio. He was up on the ballot in 2016 too, I think by 11 or 12 points, I forget exactly. So it's a real locus of non-Trump Republicans. And many people look to that state party as a place of resistance to Donald Trump. So Donald Trump understood that. The chairman of the Republican Party in Ohio is a man named Matt Borges. And he was close to Kasich. Kasich's chosen candidate to succeed. He wanted Borges to be reelected. This job came up for re-election in January, and Trump began making phone calls inside the Ohio Republican Party committee. It was a tiny little electorate that decides these things. And he flipped enough votes to defeat Borges and replace Borges with a candidate of Donald Trump's preference, who's not as experienced, not as connected to important people in the state. But that not only changed the Ohio Republican Party, it sent a message to every party in the country that Donald Trump is more popular with rank-and-file Republicans than the party's leadership. Even though he's unpopular in the country, he's popular inside the party, and that gives him leverage.
And therefore, watch your step, everybody?
Therefore, watch your steps. And that's why you see so many Republicans in Congress who are afraid to challenge him, even those like, for example, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who in so many ways might disagree with Donald Trump. And people like that are torn between two motives. The first is ambition. Republicans have won the popular vote in one of the past 7 elections, back in 2004. This is not a powerful national party. Donald Trump himself got less of the vote than John Kerry did in 2004 and barely more than Michael Dukakis did in 1988. The Republican agenda is not a popular agenda. The last time Republicans had all 3 branches of government was during the Iraq War, when they weren't able to get much done. The last time before that was before the Great Depression. So Paul Ryan sees this never-to-recur opportunity to realize his strongly held vision. So he's going to put up with a lot. And at the same time, he's terrified of Trump, because every time they've clashed, Trump has not only beaten him, but humiliated him by demonstrating to the world that Trump is popular in the party, more popular than Ryan.
So what are the true conservative believers to do nowadays when, as you and many others have pointed out, the occupant of the White House is not really a true conservative in the sense of the word we've had it come to mean over the last several decades? What do true conservatives do about this predicament?
Well, I think we may need to face up to the fact that true conservatism, so-called, as we've known it since from the 1970s to the 2010s, that may be a chapter. And we may now, many of the truths that we believed in then remain true, but the particular formula and arrangement may be out of date. The Republican world, I think, basically divides into 4 camps. The smallest camp are those who truly and sincerely believe in Donald Trump. The next smallest camp are those who truly and sincerely oppose Donald Trump. The 2 largest camps are those who hope for things from him and those who fear things from him. And those 2 right now are in coalition, and they are working to enable him. And so long as Donald Trump is able to offer Paul Ryan the hope that he can achieve things, offer others like Paul Ryan fear that he will punish them, he will be dominant within the party, and presidents then reshape conservatism reshape their parties, reshape their causes the way they think. The Democratic world is a very different place after Barack Obama than it was before. The Republican world will be even more different after Donald Trump than it was before.
Let me just follow up on that and see if we can figure that out, because when you and I obviously were growing up in Southern Ontario, it was pretty apparent that the battles, I guess, in American politics were sort of left-wing versus right-wing. And now it looks increasingly like it's national populists or nativist populists versus global cosmopolitans. Is that the way you see it nowadays?
I think that's basically right. I might use slightly different language, but I think the concept is right. Look, in the 1970s and 1980s, everywhere in the developed world, we had a big argument about the role of the state. Basically, what happened was governments had gotten very big. They grew faster than the economy, and the result was they cost more and more in taxes, and they were generating more and more inflation. And at the same time, they were doing a worse job standing up to external threats like the Soviet Union and internal threats like crime. So conservatism, and I wrote a big book about this a long time ago, conservatism was a set of answers to the problems in the 1970s. It showed how do you stop inflation, how do you restrain the growth of government, how do you bring taxes back into line, how do you stand up to threats internal like crime and threats external like the Soviet Union. And by and large, I believe, and still believe, those were good answers, and they certainly worked. The inflation went away, taxes basically stabilized, Soviet Union overthrown, crime brought down everywhere in the developed world. Now they changed the questions. And the old answers, it isn't that they're not true anymore, it's just they're not relevant because the questions are different. And with different questions, you discover different kinds of alliances. And so you discover this strange thing. How do you feel about Russian involvement inside the politics of the West? There are many people on the left who watch RT and many people on what we used to call the right who also watch RT. There's Putin sentimentality on the left and on the right. It's the National Front in France draws its votes most strongly from places that voted communist a generation ago. I don't think that's a coincidence. And so we are in a period of political and ideological change that is going to remake the party map. And one of the things that is an especial sadness to me is I spent the decade from 2007 onward saying to Republicans, unless you understand these changes from globalization, unless you have a more middle-class oriented economic policy, a more inclusive approach to healthcare, and yes, unless you restrict immigration, you're going to find yourself defeated. You're going to find something's going to happen. I didn't predict Donald Trump, obviously, but something is going to happen, and these nationalist shockwaves are going. And then when this great migration started from the Middle East and West Africa into Europe in 2013, I wrote article after article saying, stop this. You must stop this, because if you don't restrain it, I understand the compassion for the refugees, but these societies cannot absorb this shock. And what you will do is you will not find yourself bringing in refugees. You will find yourself overthrowing your own internal political order and discrediting advocates of the old way of doing things. The line I kept saying over and over again, if liberals tell the voters that only fascists want to defend borders, the voters will go hire fascists to do it because they want those borders defended. And that's the situation we face in France this year. I don't want to call Donald Trump a fascist. I don't think he is that. But something like that has happened, that the people who were entrusted, the responsible people didn't do their job responsibly. And so the voters got an irresponsible person to do it instead.
So you saw the wave coming, and the wave is now here, and the implications of the wave are now needing to be dealt with, in your view. And I guess we need to find out now what you suggest needs to happen. In your piece, you have offered some advice about how to demonstrate against the current president. What do you suggest?
Right. Well, I wrote a follow-on piece that aimed more at the magazine pieces for a very general audience, people of all points of view, and it was already long enough. And thank you for everybody reading it, but I mean, it is 7,000 words. So I wrote a follow-on piece, which was more specifically aimed at the left liberal reader, to say, if you want to organize protests, here's my advice on how to do it. And I was somebody who was on the receiving end of a lot of protests during the Iraq War, and they didn't work, and I can tell you why they didn't work. If a group assembles and it's got 99 demands and no way of agreeing on which is the most important and which is the least, and then the group then turns on each other because a man stands up to speak and someone else says, that's mansplaining, let's have a woman speak, and the woman stands up to speak and somebody says, wait a minute, you were born a woman, let's have a woman who wasn't born a woman speak, and one who's of color and disabled, that kind of turning on itself just disables protest. And then they have no program for policing their fringes against violent people, and no leadership, no way of getting things done. So my advice has been, if you believe that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, you have to lay aside the grievances that you'd have if Marco Rubio were president right now, and focus on practical, achievable demands that can be done in a law that would hem him in. And the two that I'm recommending are, first, a law to require the Department of the Treasury to publish the president's tax returns. Donald Trump won't do it voluntarily, but in the United States, the privacy of your tax return is a right conferred by Congress. It's not constitutional. It's just something Congress allows you. You can take that right away, and the Supreme Court gives you wide latitude to do things to stop corruption, require the Treasury to release his tax returns. And the second thing is an independent commission established by Congress with subpoena power to get to the bottom of Russian involvement in the 2016 election. Let's find out how much they did, and let's find out the answer to the most important question, which was there any communication between the Trump campaign and the Russians?
Given what you see out there, do you think that the president's critics are capable of what you've just prescribed?
I don't know the answer to that question. The Women's March on Washington was inspiring. I mean, it was the most orderly demonstration I've ever seen. There's not a single arrest. There were 500,000 people here that day, not a single arrest. I think people are alarmed enough, and I hope so. This is a time of testing. It's going to see what we're all made of. In many ways, what made Donald Trump possible was neglect of many of the institutions of democracy. And we have to go back to work, and we have to redevelop habits of working together and putting an end to that kind of intersectional nonsense I was describing a minute ago. But we're all in a time of revealed preference. This is a phrase the economists use, where when you go to the supermarket, you tell us what your preferences really are. And in the same way, when you act politically, you reveal what your preferences really are. At the Women's March on Washington, they did not allow pro-life women who oppose Donald Trump on the platform. So if you make that decision, that tells me, your views on abortion, even now, you regard your view on abortion as more important than your view on Donald Trump. When you say, I will stand with people I disagree with about everything, so long as we agree about Donald Trump, then you're telling me that this is priority one.
How about that building over your right shoulder, the Capitol Dome? Do you think the Democrats in there have what it takes to oppose this man?
They don't have the numbers. I think there's something like 24 Republicans who hold seats that went for Hillary Clinton in the national election. The Democrats need 18 of them. And it's certainly true that if one house of Congress were to flip, it would make a big difference. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it would make a big difference. Congress has the power to restrain Donald Trump. It just so far is not using it. And what we have seen over the past 3 administrations is Congress has become less and less interested in checking presidents of the same party. Bill Clinton did meet a lot of resistance from the Democratic majority in Congress when he had one in 1993 and 94. George W. Bush met a lot less from Republicans when he had majorities at various points during his presidency. And Barack Obama, in his first 2 years, he got everything he wanted from Democrats in Congress. Donald Trump, it's even more extreme than Barack Obama. That as public opinion polarizes, Congress is ceasing to act as a check on presidents of the same party. Well, that may mean we may need to flip party control of Congress more often.
I must tell you that regardless of where I go, and I mean on the subway, on the streets, playing hockey with my buddies, the one question I get almost more than any other, I think, is at what point in the 4 years do you think he'll be impeached? Because it's obvious he's not going to be able to finish his term. Do you have any hopes for that?
Look, impeachment is, I want to avoid crises, and impeachment itself would be a crisis. And I think there are a lot of things you can do that would restrain him far short of that. And, you know, frankly, if there ever were a law requiring the president to publish his tax returns, I think he might resign rather than do it.
Let's finish up on this, David. Here's a quote from the piece. A constitutional regime is founded upon the shared belief that the most fundamental commitment of the political system is to the rules. The rules matter more than the outcomes. I take your point, but I wonder if you feel that that's not a bit of a hard sell to those who believe that those rules that you prize have basically been in place to keep them down and to keep the Washington establishment up.
Well, may I say, as a person who's often described as a member of the Washington establishment, that the very phrase is a nonsense. Washington is not an important center of wealth and power in the United States. It's a place where wealth and power come to exert themselves, but it itself does not have wealth and power. That what the Trump people want you to think is that some lobbyist on K Street who is working for Facebook is more important than Facebook. What they want you to think is that some federal bureaucrat who's looking forward to a comfortable retirement is more powerful than the industry that bureaucrat unsuccessfully attempts to regulate. It's like with Steve Bannon. They want to say if you wear rumply clothes and are rude to people, it doesn't matter how wealthy and powerful you are. And if your grandfather was a stevedore, well then you inherit the nimbus of his stevedorism, and that's just ridiculous. I'm all for thinking seriously about wealth and power and undue influence, but let's locate them where they really are. But by the way, they don't have very many cocktail parties in Georgetown. The parking is impossible.
Well, if you're going to end on a joke, then I am too. I've known you for about 30 or 35 years. I've never seen you so down, and so my suggestion is go shave, feel better, and we'll talk again, okay?
All right, good advice. This is supposed to make me look like a Hollywood producer, but it's not working, I see.
Not working, not at all. Afraid not. Good of you to be with us, David. Take good care and feel better, okay?
All right, thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.